Hello and welcome back here at part 2 of our innovation meetup on root zone breeding of the Dutch top sector on horticulture and starting materials. I'm joined by Clemens Stolk, innovation broker and composer of our program this afternoon. Welcome back, Clemens.
Thank you.
I hope you had a good lunch break.
Yes, certainly.
And we hope you had an interesting lunch break as well, because in this live online event, we try to mimic both the great content that you're used to in an innovation startup or meetup, and also the face-to-face networking. And those of you who've participated, please fill out the short poll that I just launched. First question I want to know, did you participate in the lunch network table? Yes, 66% says, or no, I did something else. Very honest of you. Could be you take the 30 minutes to walk the dog or do something else. And the last answer I was very curious about, because this is partly an experiment to have you in this live stream, send you somewhere else, try to see if you come back. And only 16% says, I had technical difficulties. We're very sorry for that. Please let us know what happened so we can learn from that as well. For those of you who managed to get into the network tables, the next question was, how was this experience for you? And we see some of the answers here on the screen. Someone says, okay, nice, good learning opportunity, fine, basic discussion, nice, not an expert on the subject, so I mainly listened to the others. Interesting, good, participation was limited, all right. Thank you for your feedback so far. We take that into account, as well as all the questions that were submitted to Professor Malcolm Bennett that we didn't get to answer in the live stream, because we'll take those questions, I guess you take those questions, Clemens, and develop future programs on that.
For sure, yes, we will look at them.
Definitely. Let's quickly move on to our second keynote speaker of today. He is an associate professor for experimental plant ecology at the Radboud University in Nijmegen. Dr. Erik Visser. Clemens, why do you find it interesting to have him on our program today?
Yeah, well, I'm happy that Erik Visser is joining us today, because if you look at root development, root biology of plants, there are many very fundamental topics that can be investigated, very interesting fundamental questions that require research, and Erik Visser is also into them, but there are also many more practical questions that, say, plant breeders would like to have an answer to. Yeah. And I see that Erik Visser is also has an interest in those questions as well. So he combines those two angles. Yeah. And I think that makes him an interesting speaker for this afternoon.
Exactly. So transitioning that fundamental scientific knowledge into the practice and into the still scientific field of many people in industry. Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing him on the program today. Let's see if we have a live connection with Nijmegen for a short presentation. And like we did with Professor Malcolm Bennett, at the end of the presentation of Dr. Erik Visser, there is room for Q&A, significant room for Q&A, about 10-15 minutes. So if anywhere during his presentation you have a question, submit it via the chat box, which should pop up as your primary function again right now. Or if you don't have a question yourself, help Clemens and I to moderate and upvote questions that you really like us to address to Dr. Erik Visser. Erik Visser, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Gerrit.
We're very glad and honored that you're with us here today, and we would like to give you the floor for your presentation about underground plant traits, the mysteries to be solved.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'll spend the next, say, 30 minutes or a bit more to take you to a fascinating world of roots. And well, maybe first a little bit on myself. I actually came into this field from a different angle than Malcolm did, who showed you earlier that he was basically first interested in how roots develop and then gradually went into agriculture and how you can use that knowledge to apply it in agriculture. And for me, I actually started as an ecologist, a root ecologist, and was interested in the roots of wild species. And I wanted to understand how these roots function, how they develop, and eventually also like what hormones are involved in triggering different root growth patterns. And as an ecophysiologist, I was then basically interested in how plants adapt to their environment. And all in all, I do several other lines of research as well, but all in all, I'm really very much intrigued by that hidden half of the plant. But it's not easy. It's a very difficult branch of research, type of research because it's so inaccessible. And Malcolm already showed a lot of examples of how we can uncover this hidden world, but well, I'll take you a bit into maybe some other aspects of that. So what we'll see today is, okay, how do roots of wild species look like, and do they compare to roots of crop species? Can we maybe use traits that we find in wild species to combat environmental stress, maybe encountered by crop species? Can we use maybe not so much the constitutive development of the root system, but also the plasticity of the root system to grow our crops? How can we use that in farming? I'll give you an example of how we did that, and what's maybe needed in the future. Okay. So first some headings here, or at least a heading from a Dutch newspaper. Last year, everyone will know that it was a record dry year in Western Europe, and it says that actually drought is an assassin for the crops. You see a farmer here that tries to inject manure into a very dry field. Well, I wonder what the success would have been after that. And on the other hand, you see flooded tomato plants. And this is, I think this was in the US, but particularly in the Netherlands, a field that can be too wet in one part of the year can actually render into such a dry situation as you see on the left. And that's actually what I'm very interested in. So if we look at wild plant species, well, it's typically that root development actually evolved to respond to their environment because the environment is very heterogeneous. So if you take species from that same field that I just showed you, there are many species growing together there, up to 40, 50 species, very close together, often in a kind of a mosaic, interwoven root systems. And then you see, if you take them out and grow them in a pot and look at the root systems at the same developmental stage, you see that there are a wide variety of root systems present. So probably there are different solutions to coping with the same environment. And like I said, the natural environment is not like a crop field. It's much more heterogeneous, both in space and also in time. You see at the top here that there is a very densely grown experimental field here that we have in our root lab. And there are 8 species here, and you can hardly distinguish above ground which part is what, but below ground is much more difficult. So you have a lot of roots that encounter different roots of the same species of other species, and these roots need to respond to that. And there's also a big difference in time, of course, because if you look at that same experimental plot here, this was, say, in May, and only 2 months later, it looks like this. So you have a lot of differences there, both in the density of roots of your own species and other species, but also in like water distribution and also nutrient distribution. If you would go to the field and, for instance, to the river Voorlands, close to Nijmegen, where I come from, and you take a core in the soil of about 50 centimeters deep, then you see that even in that shallow layer of soil, there is a lot of difference in clay layer here, sandy here, then clay again, sand again, and we know now that plants can respond to such patches of nutrients by placing their roots at the right spot. I'll come back to that a bit later. So there is a lot of heterogeneity, both in soil strength, deeper in the soil will be more firm soil, nutrients will be distributed unevenly like water, and like I said, neighboring plants will differ all the time. And of course, crops grow in more predictable conditions. And still you see a wide variation in how roots develop. And these are pictures actually from a very nice publication already in 1927 by Weaver and Brunner. It's the root development of actual crops. And they described already the development of root systems way before we had our fancy techniques. They described it by just washing them out and spraying them out on one of these pin plates. So the roots are positioned at exactly the place where they were in the soil, and they just draw them. And no pictures, just drawing them. And then you see that even closely related species like tomato and pepper have widely different root systems after 6 to 8 weeks. And if you look at how root systems compare to, if you compare crop species with wild species, then typically the selection for in most crops for above ground yield would have led to a decrease in root-shoot ratio because we want particularly investment in photosynthesis and hence production of sugars and hence have a large yield. And also typically these roots have lower lateral root densities than closely related species that are still wild. So the cultivation, the domestication of species leads to less emphasis on root development. Here's an example of comparing annual wheat with perennial wheatgrass in a recent publication I found on the internet. And here you see that in development over the year, when the wheat is sown, in December it has a bit of a root system, and by June, by the time the crop is ready, you have a fair root system. But look at how the root system of such a perennial would look like. So the ratio of shoot to root is widely different. Of course, it's not always that there is a negative selection because, for instance, selection for stay green QTLs in the last years has also coincided with some increases in root growth, particularly if cytokinins were involved in that stay green trait, or when these were involving the maintenance of chloroplasts and therefore a longer growth period. And also some changes in root angles have been found, like Malcolm showed also that there are currently QTLs available that are responsible for these root angles of the plant. In that same very old publication in 1927, it was already recognized that root systems are not, say, constitutively growing always in the same way. This is a wild species, Forbia, and they show a picture of the plant growing on a prairie soil, which is relatively easy to penetrate and also has nutrients and water all over the soil profile. And in a gravel slide where probably drought is much more abundant, and you see that the root system is completely different. It's less deep, it's much more branched. You see that there is a different ratio of lateral roots versus main roots. So root development apparently in wild species, but as we'll see also in crop species, can show great plasticity depending on the conditions in the soil. So in our research in Nijmegen, we give priority to how root systems help crops to cope with environmental conditions, and particularly unfavorable environmental conditions. And we also take into account the increased attention for precision agriculture, because that includes smart fertilization, and that's not only the GPS-driven fertilizing of your crop field, and at one place you need a bit more than at other places, but maybe also row fertilization or other type of fertilization where you not spread the manure over the say evenly over the entire field, but maybe have concentrated patches, because that will give you difference. Well, you have also a nice overview here of our greenhouse complex 4 years ago, newly built, and here at the right you see the root lab. I will tell you a bit more about that later. So one of the approaches we have is a very straightforward way. You can actually use the potential wild relatives of crops to create a new rootstock for a commercial variety of, in this case, for instance, tomato. So we do this in the project Novel Roots for Novel Trade, together with my colleague Ivo Rieu and other colleagues at the Radboud University, and together with Bayer, Rijkswaan and Eastwest Seed. So we screened lots and lots of wild relatives of tomato, Solanum species, and looked how their root system developed, sometimes in very easy, simple systems, like Malcolm also showed here on filter paper. You can see already that there are widely different root developmental patterns. And then you can take a tomato shoot and graft them on top of that rootstock. And then even if there is no stress at all, you already see that some of these combinations grow even better than when you would leave that tomato on its own roots. So there is already some vigor happening there. And then some of these rootstocks have really phenomenal responses to environmental stress. In this case, it was a flooded plant. It has been flooded till here approximately. And you see that from the base of that plant, adventitious roots start to develop, many more than tomato root. And these adventitious roots, if you make a cross section through it, they have large air spaces, parenchyma, that contribute to aeration of these roots that grow underwater. So that makes the plant more tolerant to waterlogging. And we also have these kind of tests for all these rootstock candidates for salinity and drought in this project. So here, details are not that important now, but just to compare like how plants would perform in the control conditions and in the flooded condition, you see some of the flooded plants actually do relatively well. Of course, they're all hampered in growth, but some do much better than, say, other ones. You can see how large that adventitious root growth development can be after a couple of weeks. So that's a very straightforward way you use the root system of a wild species to improve performance of, in this case, a tomato. Well, in the Netherlands and Belgium and larger parts of the world as well, we have more frequent droughts, but they're also still unpredictable. Although you wouldn't say that because the last 2 summers were very dry and we're starting dry right away now. But here we have some pictures in Belgium in this case, maize and cauliflower. And in that case, you could say, well, you could have a constitutive root trait, maybe to improve your nutrient acquisition of the plant, but it would maybe even better if you would have a root system that responded to such an accidental drought, because then your crop might perform better, even though normally that drought wouldn't be the standard growth conditions like it would be in, say, Western Australia or parts of the US. So that root phenotypic plasticity would add to the resilience of your crop. And we played around with that bit. But first, maybe a bit of background on how nutrients can control the architecture of the root system. In very extreme cases, like here on the right, you see cluster roots formed by certain genera or families of plants. In this case, also in Western Australia, where you have very little phosphate in the soil, you see an enormous branching of these roots, and all these laterals can take up phosphorus much better because they release many of large amounts of organic acids. But even a simple common model species like Arabidopsis here responds to, in this case, iron deficiency or phosphate deficiency by developing many more root hairs. And the process behind this response to iron and phosphorus deficiency is different. And that's very surprising because the phenotype is the same. So it's also important to know what drives these processes. Oh, sorry about that. And here you see a response of Arabidopsis to if you apply a higher concentration of nitrate. So if there is plenty of nitrate available, then you see that the branching of the main root is almost completely halted. So you have a strong suppression of these lateral roots. Well, keep that in mind because here we see that high nitrate reduces lateral roots, and I will show you the opposite just in a few slides. Also with phosphate deficiency, you see a different development of the root system with more superficial roots and basically inhibition of the main root growth. So strong effects of nutrient conditions on how these root systems develop. Well, in the old days, I'd like to say, in the 70s, Malcolm Drew in England did already experiments with that. And then not so much with one type of concentration of a particular nutrient, but he gave patches of nutrients. In this case, it was on barley. This is one nodal root of barley. And in the top part and the lower part of this soil, there was hardly any phosphate available, but there was phosphate available in this middle band. And what you see is that particularly in that band, there are more roots growing, longer roots, and also more branched roots. So a control root would look like this. This is the response to phosphate, and it also responds to nitrate and ammonium, and not so much to potassium. So potassium, nitrate, what I just showed you in the previous slide on Arabidopsis, that if you give homogeneously a high concentration, you get less lateral root. But if you have a root growing in a low nitrate environment, and locally nitrate is available, then suddenly you see that there are more roots growing at that patch with nitrate. Well, just briefly returning to Arabidopsis, just to show you how plastic roots can be and how they respond to these nitrate and phosphate patches. And of course, it's not a crop, but surprisingly, actually, when I first washed out a soil-grown Arabidopsis thaliana plant, which at flowering is maybe dry weight or not even half a gram, below ground, there's not much because it was a relatively rich soil. You only have less than a tenth of that biomass. But at this, not even 25 milligrams, it was able to produce 41 meters of roots with an average diameter of about 0.15 millimeters. And if you calculate the specific root length, it meant that per gram invested dry weight, it could produce almost 2 kilometers of roots. It's just amazing. Just all in a very small pot. Well, we use these Arabidopsis plants just to see how this plastic root responses, how we could manipulate them. And we grew them in a pot, and this is the top side of that pot with 4 sections, and either all the nutrients, in this case we varied with nitrate and phosphate, and all the nutrients were evenly spread in this homogeneous pot, and this heterogeneous pot, most or all of the nitrate or phosphate was concentrated in this part, so only a quarter of the pot. Well, the other pictures are not that important, just to show you how lateral root length in the total pot developed. So until quite well after the plant started to flower, we still had root development. So these annual plants do not stop producing roots at the time they start flowering, like many other crops. Like many crops, they continue to form roots. And this is a picture of what happened. Just visualized it. It took me about an hour to wash out all these fine roots from the pot. If you have homogeneous distribution of your nutrients, the roots will approximately evenly grow in all the compartments. But if you concentrate your nutrients in this patch, then you see that 83% of your roots will indeed grow in that nutrient patch. So you can actually direct your root growth by applying nutrients in a patch. Well, these are some pictures to show how you can manipulate that a bit, because it's not that simple. It's not like, okay, where the nutrients are, that's where your roots are. These are the 4 sections of such a pot, again, in the homogeneous pot, so about equal amounts of roots, length of root in the different sections. And here we concentrated nutrient solution in that patch, and it was on a sand culture. So here there was not much of nutrients here. We watered them there, but no nutrients there. And you see that most of the nutrients indeed grow in that patch. And then when you start varying only with your nitrate or only with your phosphate, then you can get actually similar responses. In this case, the nitrate response was a bit less than the phosphate response, but if you put them both in that patch side, you get about, say, the additive response of these two. So that suggests, or might suggest, that these are independent responses. But I think they're not. What you see here is when we do not just give a random high concentration of nitrate, but we vary the concentration in that patch from 4 millimolars to 60 millimolars, then you see the pattern change. And if you would have used in the first experiment this higher concentration of nitrate, then you would have concluded, well, there is no selective root placement in that patch. Apparently, it depends on the concentration compared to the other part of the soil, what happens. And the same actually here for phosphate. If you increase your phosphate concentration in the patch, then suddenly also the roots in the non-patch part of the pot start to grow faster. So that makes it also very difficult to compare literature, because some people use maybe this concentration of patch, others use this one. And in that way you can, well, it's very difficult to compare species, and also even within the species, you can, it's difficult to compare experiments. So it's actually quite a bit more complex than that. And then moreover, is there any variation in the response? If you compare different genotypes, different accessions of Arabidopsis, well, in this case, comparison of 5 accessions of Arabidopsis, this was the one that we used already. So we took the concentration that gave a nice response. And again, we got a nice response. The other plants were not always growing evenly fast. So if I just scale them up to the same response in the patch, then you see that there is actually quite some variation here if you compare this one, which was not nearly as much responding to the patch as the C24 did. So even within a simple species like Arabidopsis, you already see quite a large variation in this type of plastic responses. And that is of course relevant also to crops, because there will be variation in your genotypes as well. And by now, a very nice recent publication in Science, which gives you a review on these nitrate and phosphate responses. We know some of the main players. There are microRNAs involved that travel through the phloem to the root system from the shoot. So actually they monitor the in this case the phosphate status of the shoot. Depending on that, you have more or less efflux of microRNAs via the phloem that inhibit controllers here that in their turn control phosphate transport in the roots. So a lot of things going on there, and actually it's starting to become more clear to us. But actually, this work has been on hold for maybe 10 to 15 years before we got a bit further. Well, back to agriculture. How to apply such responses in agriculture? Can maybe, there was a hypothesis that we have, if we would have deeper soil nutrients, maybe the roots would be triggered to be growing deeper, and maybe that would prevent drought stress, because deeper in the soil will also be more water available, particularly during drought conditions. So we knew that maize showed selective root placement. A student that later became PhD student at our lab, just recently graduated, Dina and Son, did this in Switzerland at the lab of Andy Hund, and she showed that these are roots of the same plant, again at a high nitrogen part of the filter paper. You have many more roots than when you wouldn't apply nitrogen to the other part of the roots. So we studied that in the Nijmegen root lab, where we have a facility that is basically outdoors with a rain shelter, and where we can grow crops until they're, say, harvest sized, and then harvest the roots, and in the meantime study the roots by these mini rhizotron tubes here. I'll show you a few details a bit later. So we grew there maize in these compartments of 175 liters each in ambient conditions. And this is such a container with 3 compartments with different conditions, and then there's yet another condition. So we had either nutrients in the top, or we had them in the top in the patch, or we had them, say, deeper in the soil, say at 30 centimeters or so, or we had them deeper in the soil but then as a patch. And then half of the containers were just in ambient irrigated conditions, and the other were in drought conditions somewhere halfway the growing season. This was done by Christian Fritz in a project called URoot, financed by the European Commission, with a lot of many other collaborators. There were 20 labs involved. So filling these containers here, just to give you an impression, these are the mini rhizotron tubes, which we can just send in a scanner and see how many roots are growing at a particular depth. This is how the patch looks like. This was filled in nutrient-rich soil. And well, when you look in time how the plants were growing in 2 weeks, and that's of course nice. Maize grows very big in a short time, and in the end we had plants that were near harvest time, and then we harvested plants for above ground biomass. So seed set in such a setting is not very well, because you don't have sufficient density of maize plants, but still biomass predicts very much what would have been developing as cobs. So what you see is you put the nutrients deep in the case of maize, and there was a variety that's actually quite shallowly rooted normally. You see a delay, so the lower 2 lines are the plants that had nutrients deep in the soil. Even though they didn't get drought, you see that they are lagging behind. But if you look at the dry weight at the end, then yes, there was a bit of a response. The drought wasn't that severe, so there's a depression. If you put the nutrients in the top and compare it to, say, normal conditions in the as a farmer would apply them, so nutrients in the top and irrigated, well, if you would have the drought, then there would be a decrease in yield, but it was maybe some 10% or so. But if you would have nutrients deeper in the soil, then there was an effect. It was not completely recovering the yield that you would have when there would not be drought, but there was some response. So it made us optimistic, but we were, of course, much more interested in what happened below ground. So what happened in time with these root pictures that we took in the mini rhizotron tubes? This is how typically that root system would develop. And we also took soil cores at the end and just washed out the roots and just looked where the roots were. So this is one of these mini rhizotron tubes. If you look inside, you can already see a high density of roots growing to the surface of that tube. Well, this is when you wash out the root system in situ. You see there were 3 plants per container. This is just one. You can imagine how many roots were available there. It's really a lot, but where were they? So we had a look at that. This is a bit complex, but if we look at the upper half of the soil column, so the topsoil, then if you would have your nutrients in that topsoil, you see most of the roots are there. If you would have placed your nutrients deeper in the soil, then there are far fewer roots in that area available. So probably they are deeper in the soil then. If you would have drought at the same time, then you would have a depression of these high root densities, even if you would have your nutrients shallowly placed in that soil. And when you look at the lower half of that soil column, then yes, if you have nutrients in the deeper part, then that's where the roots are, and the same actually in the drought conditions. So apparently these deep nutrients were able to trigger deeper root growth and also in that way maybe partly recover the loss of biomass above ground that we saw. Well, this is a bit, we don't need to look at all the details, but when you look at the patches and you see that inside the patch, the concentrations of roots were much, much higher yet than if you would give these nutrients just throughout the entire soil volume of that topsoil. So we get indeed a much more attracting part of the soil where all the roots are gathering. And the same happened when you would take that patch in the deeper part of the soil. We did a similar thing for wheat plants, and there the response was a bit stronger actually, and the root responses were even stronger than in maize. So we see here again, this is shallow nutrients applied either in irrigated conditions. Well, plants are doing fine. These are plants growing in drought conditions. So this was what a farmer might experience if we would have a, say, well, a regular drought, not too severe, but some drought, you would lose maybe 20% of your harvest. But then, if we would have placed the nutrients deeper in the soil, and of course it's going to be a question how to do that, but still, you see that there was no loss of biomass whatsoever caused by the drought, simply by having beforehand your nutrients deeper in the soil. So the plasticity of the root system in these wheat plants is tremendous, and we saw a very strong response of the root system resulting in these better harvests. Well, then you would say, well, then we need to spend a lot of money on how these roots behave. But when you look at how many projects have been financed from TKI in the last years, it's just a handful compared to how much it's been financed above ground, on above ground trades. So I think the challenge will be, and maybe this is a start, this meeting today, to bring together the stakeholders and science and invest more, maybe not so much as the, say, the English community can, but at least more in understanding how root growth is controlled and how plasticity is improved. So I thank you all for joining me, and that was my message for today.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Erik Visser, live with us from Nijmegen. And I think with your last point, you're aligning fully with Clemens Stolk here in the studio. When I asked him why did you bring the topic of root zone breeding to the table, he also referred to the amount of projects and research projects going on. At the same time, I think you're preaching to the choir a bit, because everybody involved in this event is already interested in the root zone breeding. But a nice cliffhanger here. At the end, Michiel Roelse, the director of the top sector horticulture and starting materials, will explain a bit more about the call, which is has a deadline for May 31st, about how new projects can apply. So stay tuned for that. Clemens, first response when you listen to the key message here about understanding the plant traits under the surface?
Yeah, well, I think it is highly interesting, of course, that you see that plant roots can be so plastic, and also that you can actually manipulate them into making better use of their environment in terms of recruiting water and nutrients, other resources.
Yeah.
So, yeah, my question to Eric would be, but maybe you have other questions first. But what would be your dream project if you would have the opportunity to invite now people from the audience
to participate.
To participate.
We do have quite some audience questions already, so help us moderate with your thumbs up. But let's pitch that question to you first, Eric. What would be your dream project under the surface?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would like to invest in at least some of the equipment that Malcolm talked about.
Yeah, the root robot.
I think that is for, well, it is actually accessible because it is a Europe-wide platform where you can apply for. But still, that would be nice because then you would have more details. So far, we also rely quite a bit on how much you can actually wash out and how much of the data you can process.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yes, some of the high throughput materials would be very nice.
Nice. Thanks for connecting the two talks together. Let's start with the first audience question, which was submitted originally by Marinke de Haas, but it's backed up by 11 viewers already. And Marinke is asking, what kind of treatment of young plants would you advise in order to stimulate plasticity in the root systems of old plants, or adult plants, she actually writes. What can we do in the early phase of the plant to stimulate this plasticity?
Well, the idea is, I think, that if you have, as a young plant, already a larger root system, then you have more options. If you stick with a relatively small root system, then your say the range of plasticity will be smaller. So, as a young plant, for young plants, invest in let them have a relatively larger root system. If conditions don't need it later, then further root development will just be delayed. But if you need more roots, then you have the potential and the meristems actually to invest in.
Yeah, so basically your key takeaway there is lay the foundation for the plant later to go deeper if needed. Yeah. Thanks. Another question that came in quite early during your talk is from someone who names himself JP Virtual Roots. And it's interesting because maybe you have an opportunity here to tell the breeder industry a lesson. He writes, one of the best benefits of breeding were, he already speaks in the past tense, increases in the harvest index, which may imply a reduced root system size. Are further decreases in favor of this harvest index still desirable, or have we as breeders inadvertently overdone this? What's your opinion on this, Eric?
I think it was fine till now, but if we have the challenge now of changing conditions, using less nutrients just by legislation, having more severe weather conditions, particularly drought, but also too wet conditions in spring, for instance. Then I think that we might want to have a change there. So I wouldn't say that it has been overdone now, but I think we need to take that step back now. If we want plants to be more resilient to these changing conditions.
Yeah, could be a more important pivoting point in the history of crop breeding. This little online event where we say, okay, from now on.
So I can maybe add to that because I've been talking to some farmers and they say, well, I just give more water and then I'll just solve that drought. But in the last 2 summers, there wasn't just simply not enough water to give that more water. So and some others say, well, I've just an insurance for that. So if there is a year off, then that's fine. I will be paid for it. But of course, if that continues to be more frequent, then there won't be any insurance anymore. That will be, say, payable. Will be too costly then to actually pay for these losses. Yeah. So I would advise to look also at the longer term and not just the coming 10 years or so.
Time for change. Very important message of today. Another question just recently submitted by Corné Pietersen. What can you say about how plastic are plant genomes to maximize the root plasticity?
Good question, Corné. I'm not sure. What I see is that the crop species we tested still have a large potential for plasticity, but we see differences already. Like in that Arabidopsis plant, I think also in the germplasm of the crops, there is a lot of variation that we don't know anything about yet because there have not been large screenings except for drought-prone species like wheat, as Malcolm told us earlier. So there is insufficient knowledge on how these different genotypes, how much they can actually have these plastic responses.
Exactly. So I guess we're really pushing against the boundaries of science here today, Clemens. And the fact that our audience is asking these questions means that they're hungry for it.
Very good sign.
Yeah, very good sign. Now, here's someone who at the Real Innovation Meetup, I'm not sure how well you would be doing in networking. If you name yourself Donald Trump, it's funny. Okay, we have a smile, but nobody knows who you are. But still, on behalf of Donald Trump, the question reads, leaves will wilt as a result of drought. What do we know about the physical appearance of roots during stresses of drought? Do we see any changes as a result of that environment?
Yeah, so what typically will happen, particularly in severe drought, is that the root will shrink. And that has an advantage because the contact with the soil is less. And if you have a severe drought, then your water potential in the soil will be stronger negatively, more strongly negative than inside the root, and it may actually lose water to the soil. So it's actually an adaptive response, but typically there would be a shrinkage of the root system. And of course, you have your anatomical changes, as Malcolm already explained, that you have changes in your diameter of your xylem vessels, etc. So there are several responses. One is immediate, just the current root will shrink simply because it holds less water, and the volume will become smaller. And it has actually been shown that that is an adaptive response as well.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing. There's some more clarifying questions about some of the stuff you've shown us this afternoon. Again, a question from JP Virtual Roots, who reads, did deep nutrition placement simply delay the plant development and thereby conserve water? Or did the deep roots take up more water in total?
Yeah, that's a fair question for the maize. So we did some calculations on that, and in the end, the total biomass was the same, but it could have had effects on evaporation. But in this case, it was a kind of an artificial system because our containers are 70 centimeters deep, and so you have a chance that if you supply deeper groundwater, that just capillary rise will actually bring up the water to relatively shallow areas. So we had a boundary layer with some gravel that actually broke that capillary rise. So in the deeper soil, there was sufficient water available. So there was a reward for the deeper roots. I think that once the roots were deep enough, then yes, the plants were basically safe. In the early development, it might have an effect that some of the plants were developing a bit more slowly. But when you compare it to the wheat plants, they didn't show any delay in that initial period. And there we saw even a stronger effect of that beneficial effect of having deeper nutrients. I do realize that deeper nutrients is a bit controversial because now we're aiming for more and more, say, no-tilling systems. So it's difficult to get these nutrients that deep. But I'm pretty sure that with the current innovations on where to put your manure, that a depth of 25 or 30 centimeters should not necessarily be a problem on the lighter soils.
Exactly. Yeah, and you refer to on something, and that is obviously, I guess, the complex game of plant breeding and also of crop growing, all these different factors that play into each other. That pitches right into a question that HVE is submitting, and 7 people are giving that a thumbs up, and that is, Is there a trade-off, or what is the trade-off? Is more roots always better, or can a root system be too big at the expense of yield? What are your observations or knowledge about that?
Yeah, definitely every bit of carbon invested in the root system is at the expense of what will go to the shoot. So definitely there will be a trade-off. But if you have a plastic root system, it will only respond when it needs to, and then that would not happen, because if everything is fine and conditions are just favorable, then it wouldn't develop that much. But it should have the potential to grow bigger if it's needed, for instance, in case of a drought. So then you wouldn't have that trade-off, because if it wouldn't
Eric,
invest in more...
would this be a short-term, long-term trade-off? Right? If you're growing for a crop that is in your field for longer times, multiple summers perhaps, you would be more resilient. And if you have fast cycles of crop, maybe you don't need that much of roots?
No, not necessarily. Well, definitely if you would have a crop that will be on the field for several years, and there aren't that many at this time, but then typically you would have a larger root system. Because it will also overwinter and grow bigger and bigger next year, etc. But what I mean is that in the case of annual crops, it would be beneficial to have a root system that grows to its needs. So if a bigger root system is needed, it grows a bigger root system, and if not, it just stays at a fairly moderate investment of carbon. So if we could aim for that, then I think you would have an ideotype that is able to challenge the difficulties of unpredictable droughts, unpredictable wet conditions. Because during wet conditions, you maybe even want just a very shallow root system, or maybe a root system that can at least form some parenchyma, but normally it doesn't. And that is typical for the cereals, that parenchyma is formed at its needs. So it's induced by ethylene production, and then cell lysis in the existing roots. So it actually can make a parenchyma in an existing root, but it wouldn't make it if it's not needed, if there is no flood.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for elaborating on that. Clemens, I think we still have a few questions, but I'm also looking at the clock. So I propose that you will take those questions and use them to build your next program on root zone breeding. Any final remarks for Dr. Eric Visser?
Well, what I learned today, that roots are much more important actually than when we started thinking of this program. Like Malcolm Bennett mentioned, even soil compaction, that you can breed crops that can be beneficial for fighting soil compaction. And also the perspectives that Eric just gave makes you think even of climate resilience. Can you grow crops that are both better at capturing nutrients and also withstanding drought? So that's, I think, very important topics that are all related to roots.
Yes, yeah. And with that, we stick with the last part of your title, Eric. Many mysteries to be solved. And let's underline again your challenge for our audience today. We need more research projects into the root zone, right? With that, we'd like to...
I fully agree with that.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us live from the University of Nijmegen. And hopefully you stick around for our networking reception that's going to start soon. Thank you.
Yes, I'll be around. Yeah, thank you.
All right. With that, we are going to reflect and briefly look back at our lunch experiment. And now on the screen, on the side of Eric, well, Eric just clicked away, we see our moderators of the afternoon lunch break sessions. Good afternoon, everyone. You see us, hear us? Yes, we have a connection. We tried to give our audience a little face time based on 3 specific statements that you were guiding the conversation on. And the first statement read, breeding for root traits is not necessary. I'm curious to learn, in any of your breakout tables, was there anybody who would actually be on that standpoint, who'd like to comment on that? Okay, Gabino, I see you're talking. Please unmute yourself and tell us what happened.
So at least in my session, I can say that there were some comments regarding, okay, this is fine. These new root phyton typing technologies are fancy, but how are they going to end up in a breeding program? That's there's a leap of faith still because there is a lot of investment that needs to be done there. And at the end of the day, most of the things that they see is an indirect measurement. So if the yield is good, roots might be doing fine. So actually yield becomes as a way of proxy for knowing these things. So why invest in these things? So people were a little bit skeptical to take the step towards adopting these new fancy technologies, that getting a CT scan and a bunch of physicists and mathematicians to do some bioinformatics. Well, that could be a challenge for many of the companies around. So how to bridge that gap becomes one of the major challenges, I think, for right now.
Thank you, Gabino. Thank you for sharing that. You're with Green Innovations, and thank you for being with us. I'm curious. I'm looking at some of you others. Were there in your round table someone who said, "Well, in fact, yes, we are moving full on," and we had the second statement: "We cannot do without high-tech methods and deep learning algorithms." Who would like to respond? Just raise your hands and start talking. Eric?
Maybe I can comment on that. Yes, thanks for allowing me on. I actually had a company that's dealing in routing cuttings, and actually these companies, I didn't realize it, but this is something that they are doing. It's part of their breeding program. The most important thing for a cutting is, of course, making sure that it can actually read. She was also explaining, that sometimes if they don't do that, you may come to commercializing a product, and then in the end, when you want it to root, it doesn't even root. So for them, it's very, very vital. And they were probably one of the companies that said in your first, let's say, polls, thank you, that they were probably breeding for it. Yes, full on, absolutely.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing, Eric Jukers with Cantor Europe. The third statement was about we need a completely new phenotyping strategy because we need to create resilient crops with multiple traits. Did any of you get so far in the discussion, and what did you take away from that? Yes, go ahead, Monique.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you. We actually started with proposition 3, so we started to move forward. I think the consensus was within the group that it would be nice to have such a highly plastic system, but we don't necessarily need a wholly new phenotyping system. We think right now in breeding, a lot of the breeding already maybe indirectly targets roots. You maybe just don't know that you are selectively targeting for the roots. But we all agree with Erik actually that a lot more research is needed, and it was nice to see, or at least that's the feedback I got from the group, it was nice to see that both in academia and in industry this is becoming more and more of a topic, so they're quite optimistic in increasing root breeding.
All right, thank you for sharing, Monique, with Plantum today. I heard someone else unmute themselves and join the conversation. Was it you, Bernard, or who started to chip in on this last question?
I was playing around. But anyway, we didn't bother too much about the propositions during our lunch meeting, but we really wondered which crop would benefit on short notice from all these high-tech developments. And in fact, we concluded that at this moment, this might be more an avenue for the high-value crops and not for the low-value crops. And in our group, we believe that crop breeding for the high-value crops for cereals, for example, might be very beneficial from these developments in a period of 4 to 5 years. For vegetable crops, for 3 to 4 years, for vegetable crops in about 5 years, and for example, for ornamental crops in 7 years. So many of the things in the propositions were of course discussed, but not the propositions as such, and we really looked into the benefit of these current developments.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Bernard de Geus, and the learning that we need to distinguish per crop, whether it's worth to dive into this as well. Who else would like to share a reflection about this experiment? Yes, Guus Hesselmans, go ahead.
Yes, it was a very interesting morning. We concluded with our table. Our table consisted only, that's a little bit pity, but on the other hand, we had a very interesting discussion our table were purely filled with breeders, field crop breeders, 2 from the Netherlands and 1 from the Philippines, so very international. Yes, as mentioned before, we already look to the crop on whole and then indirectly on the root, but we want to know much more about the root system, and therefore we need, especially in the field crops, we need phenotyping systems, non-destructive. Yes, we would really like to have that on the field in a different environment. After that, we can use them at least to understand what's happening. And before that, it's important to get the topics of plant physiology in. And I think first the understanding is more important than having all the data through algorithms, because then as breeders we don't know what's happening, and then we get a little bit uncomfortable. So we need an order in the approach.
Thank you for sharing. And it's an important takeaway, I think, for all of us. I'm looking on my screen, and I spot you, Joost Kos with Syngenta, one of our 2 sponsors also of today. I definitely want to give you a big thank you on that, together with the team from Rijkswaan, Ronald Driessen. Are you with us as well? Joost, what was your... Can you describe the experience of having some FaceTime over lunch virtually?
Yeah, no, I think it was great. Particularly the topic was exciting to everyone. We had a nice mix of different nationalities, but also different backgrounds, like the industry, but also the science part. So it was really nice to learn from each other, different insights, expertise, which I think stimulated the thinking a lot. And one of the challenges which came out was about the need to have high throughput phenotyping technologies like Guus, I think, was mentioning for the field, which are really key, because as breeders you select in large populations, and just fixing it at the end is not probably the best way forward. So if you want to be successful, you need to have these type of high throughput technologies. But the overall experience was really positive. Everyone participated, and I sensed was excited about the topic and the discussion.
Thank you for sharing your experience with us, Joost, and thank you for staying. I'm looking through the screen and also looking at my clock. Who would really like to has the feeling that, wait a second, something happened in our breakout that I definitely want to share? Hanneke, anything interesting on your end? Please.
Yes.
Yeah, there you are.
It was a very nice experience as well. We had a small group consisting of also scientists and 3 people from more the industry. We talked about also the applicability of phenotyping of your root system for the flower industry, which generally also works with rootstock systems. So that was a very interesting discussion, actually. So we all agreed that actually there's a need for high-tech methods, or that it would be very interesting to use them. But indeed, I agree, same as the group of Bernard de Geus came to conclude, that the investment needed to get access to these technologies, plus to make them commercially viable, they have to be capable of high throughput, and at the moment it's a question whether that's already possible. Secondly, indeed, working with a multidisciplinary team, especially for maybe smaller breeding companies, might be a bottleneck to use these technologies, because you simply don't have the expertise on board to, let's say, translate the output into your breeding pipeline. So that's what we identified also as a potential bottleneck in using these systems in a commercial setting.
Yeah. Strong point, and important to understand. I think, Clemens, I hear you verbally nodding.
Yes. Well, I think this is also one reason why we are together now. You mentioned already the TKI call, which has a deadline for 31st of May for project ideas. So that is one of the means of multiplying your investments as a company if you want to do research. And of course, there are other opportunities as well. I think Malcolm mentioned a few European funding sources. So if you want to do something in this area, don't try to do it alone, I would say, but do it together with other companies and with scientists and get funding for what you want to do.
Exactly. Well, that's an important point. Let's get together. And that's a nice transition also into what's going to happen in about 10 minutes or so. As I said, we're going to try to replicate an online virtual networking reception where we look at each other, where we look up people we already know, and we're going to do some randomized networking with potentially people we don't know. But before that, we first want to learn more about the call. And we want to thank our moderators here on the screen. With all your means, give them a big round of virtual applause. Use hashtag Impact2025 on LinkedIn, on Twitter if you're still there, and show the praise for our moderators. Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us. We hope to see you back in the virtual. Yeah, Eric Jukes is using the virtual wave on screen as well. Thank you, Eric. And we look forward to having the networking reception with you. In the meantime, I spotted José Vogelenzang is also sharing her takeaways from the round table, so we can also still use the chat. Thank you for now, and I hope to see you back in a little bit in the virtual breakout session. Because we've been mentioning it now for 3 times already. That call, more practice, projects, we need more products. And that is the cliffhanger that we started this program with. He's back in position, the operational director of the top sector horticulture and starting materials, for his closing words and a little bit more explanation of what we can start to work on for May 31st. Michiel Roos.
Okay, well, I promised to get back to you with more info on the call. The call is actually still open, like Clemens mentioned. So this is quite exciting for us because this is the first time we teamed up with 2 other top sectors, agriculture and food and water. So there's 3 top sectors involved. Total budget is 15 million for 2021. So considering the fact that most of our projects run for 4 years, the total budget is actually more in the area of 60 million euros for 4 years. There's 2 phases, 2 stages. We are now in the project ID stage, like Clemens said, closing on May 31st at midnight. All you have to do to be part of this game is send in a project ID. Go to topsectortu.nl for the correct format. Fill it. It's only half a page. Send it in, and that will make you eligible to send in a full proposal in a later stage during the summer. You will be invited to send in a full proposal. As usual, we have a triple assessment procedure, a triple review procedure. One is we check for eligibility. Are you in compliance with all the requirements that we have concerning intellectual property, the appropriateness of your budget? Do you have a consortium of at least 1 research organization and 2 companies, that sort of thing? Of course, we assess for strategic fit as well. How does your project line up with our knowledge and innovation agenda? And of course, we assess for quality of the proposal, quality of the consortium, feasibility of your project, that sort of thing. Considering the topic of today and the fact that we have literally dozens of companies and researchers, I look forward to, let me rephrase that, I challenge you to come up with as many root zone projects as possible. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed here. One thing I would like to mention is, of course, the fact that we require a considerable private commitment for our projects. The private contribution to every project is in the area of 50%, and half of that should be in cash. And I understand quite well that companies at this particular moment will be very careful with their resources and may be hesitant to commit to investing in research projects. But as I said before, investing in innovation and R&D is the quickest way out of this situation. And at the same time, I talk to a lot of companies and they tell me that the corona crisis has exposed weaknesses in their operating systems and in their business models, weaknesses that have to be taken care of right away. And they talk to me about speeding up the transition that they were already in, but now has to be faster. And the subjects mentioned most are automation, robotization, and digital transformation. So we expect a lot of project proposals on that subject too. And as I said, if companies are experiencing trouble, we can help with that. We can help with partners. We can help with research infrastructure. We can help with knowledge, and we can help with funding. So my final tip for anybody considering to apply for funding for the top sector call is very simple. It's a very simple tip, but you'd be surprised at the number of researchers who do not take this into consideration at all. And that is, read the call documents. Read the documents, because they will specify in great detail what it is exactly that we're looking for. Read the documents, get into our heads, adopt our way of thinking, try to see where we're coming from and where we want to go. It's as simple as that. Adopt our terminology in your project proposal, and then tell us in our own words why we need your project. That is my tip. Simple but very effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michiel Roelsen. And obviously, in order to come up with a successful project call, 80% of success is showing up. And you need to show up to the table with the right partners together. Normally, when I was talking to Michiel, when I was talking to you, Clemens, and talking about this innovation meetup, we say, yes, science, content is important, but the real magic happens when people meet, when they connect, and when they develop ideas. And that's what we're going to do next. So stay tuned before I explain to you in detail how to get into our big mega networking, virtual networking reception, but not before I go to my co-host of today, Clemens Stolk. Clemens, as a final word, what is your reflection? What was this experience like for you?
For me, it was very interesting, both on the science part, but also on the feeling I get from the networking part so far already. I think, yeah, it was an experiment, as you said. For us, it's the first time, and for everyone, I think this is rather new. But yeah, so far I'm excited, and I'll be interested to hear later on what people really thought of it. But yes.
Well, we're asking currently on the Slido app for a little poll to give us a rating. In the end, we want to boil down this entire experience to a number between 1 and 10, but also, of course, in a second question, try to describe that experience to us. For this far, this is where also for our viewers who watch the recording in YouTube, this is the end of the official content program. We're going to hop over to a Zoom XL where we're going to have some networking fun. I'll guide you through it. We will actually have some more FaceTime face-to-face in a large group. We will have some chat interactions one-on-one, and we will have these small 4-person randomized networking breakouts. I'll explain how that works in detail when you get there. And how do you get there? Well, the first thing that you need to do is one more time revert back to that email you received this morning or yesterday with the 3 different links. Well, you've gotten this far, so you're going to work this out. Now it's time to click on the 3rd link. If you somehow have lost track of the email, Sibrin is currently also posting the link to the Zoom in the Slido chat, so you can click on it over there as well. And in a few minutes, 2-3 minutes, I think, we're going to open up this Zoom XL, and you'll see me back there on the other side, and I'll guide you through what we're going to do. If you somehow cannot make it to our virtual networking reception, make sure you let your network know about what your most important takeaways are from this innovation meetup on root zone breeding. And please, if you do that on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Instagram, maybe even, use hashtag Impact2025. Because if you do that in your message, we can click on it, we can find it, and we can continue our virtual networking as well. For those who participated in the lunch networking breaks, be aware that that platform will be open to at least June 1st. So there again, you can go through the list of delegates, click on their profiles, connect with them on LinkedIn or via email, and in this way also further, well, I guess, entangle the roots of this horticulture and starting materials community. And together, as Michiel Roelsen said earlier today, we are the innovation frontline, so we need to come out stronger. With that, we're going to close the broadcast right here. We're going to hop over to Zoom. Clemens Stolk, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching.